Welcome back to Like Maria. Today I'm concentrating on Blake and his poem London, and we're going to talk about context. So when you finish this session, you'll be able to talk about Blake and his context, just like Maria. So there's 5 key points I'm going to tell you today about Blake and his context. Number 1 is that Blake was an artist. He was working around the end of the 18th, early 19th century, and he did very detailed artistic prints of many of his poems. I think you can see this in London because of the quality and detail of his visual descriptions. He really looks at the way that the buildings are blackening, or he talks about the chartered streets and points you towards the Thames. So there is significant detail in this poem, and you could say that this might come from his artistic eye. The second point I want to make is that Blake is a romantic poet, and romantic poets often idealise the countryside and the wonders of nature, and were less complimentary about city environments, particularly after the Industrial Revolution, where the cities were often dirty places and places of oppression, and places where people had to work in factories, etc. And Blake was well known for speaking out against these cities and the difficulties that people had living in these cities. Point number 3 is that Blake himself was a Londoner, so he was very used to walking around London. And London of Blake's time was not a particularly pleasant place. So there would be smog and smoke from the factories. There were plenty of criminals and people who had fallen on hard times about the streets at night. And there would have been quite a lot of noise. In Blake's poem, he talks about cries, hearing cries of people. And there's quite a lot of unpleasantness and unpleasant noise, and probably unpleasant smells, and certainly unpleasant sights in the city, which Blake would have been very familiar with because he was a Londoner by birth. Romantic poets also considered personal and social justice to be quite key. And this was coming in on the back of the French Revolution, where they didn't like people having privileges and treating people who had less money and less opportunity in a bad, oppressive way. And the French Revolution had highlighted some of these cases, and Blake was political in his views and wanted to say that the government of the time and the way that the king ruled the country was not very sympathetic to the ordinary people, and he often highlighted this in his poetry. The next point I want to make is that Blake wrote a series of poems called Innocence and Experience, and they dealt with young people and pleasant landscapes that were then turned by the Industrial Revolution or by the knocks and hardships of life into things of experience, bad things. This poem is in that series, and indeed it talks about opportunities of youth being oppressed. So there is a youthful harlot, there is a baby who cries but cries in fear, and there is a marriage hearse. The positivity of marriage is joined up with the negativity of death. So Blake was very interested in looking at these notions of innocence and experience and what turned a promising life into one that was a very difficult and miserable life and actually ended in death. So I hope today that you found out a little bit more about Blake's context and can refer to it when you write about London, just like Maria.